In this video, we're going to talk more about object-oriented design. We're going to be focusing on how to define a class using data fields and methods. And we're also going to look at how to write a specific kind of method called a setter method. So we're going to be writing our class that models information about a student at a university. And last time we looked at a description of the student class. We said it's going to store the student's last name, first name, GPA, and the number of credits they've earned so far. So we're going to be looking at how to write that in Java. I'll pull up IntelliJ in a second so that we can write it together. If you have IntelliJ, you're welcome to type along with me. I think that might be useful to you. And we're going to be creating this class. The class always has two parts. It has data fields. Those are the essential pieces of information that model the real world object. So they define the state of the object. In other words, what are the current values associated with this variable? And when we create classes and we create variables from those classes, those objects are always reference types. So that, remember, those are kind of like the bigger kinds of data types in Java where it bundles together multiple pieces of information. So these data fields are defining what information gets bundled together. The other component of a class is the method definitions. Those are the operations that we can perform on the object. And for the first classes that we're going to write, those operations are going to be pretty simple. So let's look at the general syntax for defining a class. Defining a class looks like this. It always starts with the words public class. Those are reserved words. And then you pick a name that you want to give to your data type. You don't have to use the word type in the class name, but a lot of times I'll do that just so that I remember, hey, that's a data type, not an identifier for a variable. And then at the top of the class, you include all of the data field definitions. Those are the essential pieces of information that represent that data type. The scope of all the data fields extends through the whole class, including all the methods. So it's pretty nice. If you declare something as a data field, you don't have to worry about passing it as a parameter within that data type. All of the methods in there will get access to it. But you still want to be selective about which data values you include as data fields. Like if you just had, say, like a counter that counted up like how many loop iterations there were or something like that, that wouldn't be a data field. That's probably not essential information about a data type. The other component is the method definitions, and those are going to go down towards the bottom of the class file. Those represent all the operations that can be performed on the data. So we're going to start writing a data type that models our student data type for our university project. The first thing we're going to think about is, what are those essential pieces of information that we have to store about a student? Those are the pieces of information that will be our data fields in the class. The description tells us what these are. We just have to read through it carefully. So it tells us, develop a system that tracks information about students at a university, including their first name, last name, GPA, and total credits earned. Those items that it specifies, those are going to be our data fields, the essential pieces of information that model a student in our project. So we're going to put those into our class. We're going to define a data field for each of those items. It's going to look like this. I'll type it into IntelliJ in a second. But for each of the data fields, we're going to put in the word protected and then the data type, whatever it is, and then pick an identifier for it. So let me pull up IntelliJ. So I created a project already. And remember, when we open IntelliJ, it usually opens like your main class file. So now we're not writing student as part of the main class. We need to make a new file. So I'm going to go to new, and then I'm going to choose Java class. And then I need to type in the name for it. So I'm going to call it student type. And then it'll open up a second file within your same project. So see how main and student type are at the same level? That's going to help the compiler to find all of it. So this new data type, student type, that's where we're going to write all of our data about a student. And remember, we said there are 4 essential pieces of information. There's a student's first name, so I'm going to include that. There's a string that represents their last name. And then we need to store information about their GPA, so I'm going to make that a double. And then finally, we want to know how many credits have they earned. I'm going to use an integer for that. Those are my data fields. Sometimes they're called data members. Sometimes I'll call them data members. Or you might read online or in the textbook, it might call them data members. Those mean the same thing. Data fields, data members means the essential data that represents this particular class. So what does this mean when we put these fields into the student type? What it means is that if in our main program, we declare an object of type student, in here I called my type student, and in the file we just created, I called it student type. Those mean the same thing. So student, and then is the data type, and then you have to give it a variable name equals new student, so that's going to let us declare an object of type student. And what the data fields that we've just created set up is the ability when it creates that new student, a student, it's going to have these 4 data fields bundled inside that one object, a student. So it encapsulates that data. I think of it as like, you know those like cold capsules you get where it has like the gelatin coating on the outside and then you see little like dots on the inside that are like the little medications things. I think about the class as encapsulating all of these data fields. They're like the little bubbles of medicine that are inside the outer capsule. You can also think of encapsulation as just meaning groups together. And encapsulation is one of the key ideas within object-oriented design. So you'll hear a lot of buzz about encapsulation. So at this point, we've created those data fields as part of our class. We know that the other part of a class are the operations that we might perform on this bundle of information. So we're going to turn our attention to those. And one thing you might notice is that our data values aren't initialized in this declaration. They just have kind of like random values in it, nothing that we can count on. So one thing we might want to do in our data type is establish or assign values to all those data fields. And traditionally, we call methods that allow us to assign values to data members the setter methods for the class. So we're going to write some setter methods. Each setter method is a very small method. They're very focused on what they're supposed to do. Each of them is going to take a parameter, and that parameter will be used to assign a value to one data field in the object. Setter methods don't need to return any information. The return value is always void on setters. So the general format for a setter method looks like this. Put in the word public, and then the return type's always void. And then you call it set, and then pick one of the data field identifiers. Then you list out the parameter type and a parameter name. And then you use that parameter to establish a value for one of the data fields. So we're going to add setter methods for each of the data fields in our student class. Oops. Where's my IntelliJ? Oh, it's still up here. Okay, so in my class, I'm going to create a public, spelled right, void method, and I'm going to write one that sets the value for first name. So I'm going to call it set first name. And then I need to include a parameter that matches up with the data type that I'm trying to assign. So I'm trying to assign a value to first name. It's a string. That means my data type for the parameter is going to be string. And then I can call the parameter anything I want. So I could call it like first. And then the body of my setter methods are always really straightforward. You always want to assign a value to the data field. So I'm going to say first name, that's my data field, equals, and then I'm getting the value for that from this parameter first. And that's the whole method. Again, it's a very focused method. Its whole goal is to allow me to pass in a value and use that to assign a value to one of my data fields. Let's do one for the last name. So we'd have set last name, string last, and you can call it whatever you want. And then we could say last name, that's my data field name. It's up at the top. And I'm setting that equal to my parameter value last. Oops. Let's do the GPA. So we have public void, and then we'd want to set GPA. And then it takes a double as a parameter because the data value or data type of GPA is double. So I'm going to say double. Let's see what happens when we try to use the exact same data field name as our parameter. So when we do that, we have to be a little bit careful. We have to be able to distinguish which, when are we talking about the GPA that's the data field, and when are we talking about the GPA that's the parameter? If we just say GPA equals GPA, you can imagine the computer's going to get pretty confused about that. It actually thinks of this as just the name of the parameter, and so that's not going to affect this data value that's the data field. If we name them both the same thing, we have to put an extra reserved word in front of the data field name. We have to say this.gpa. That means go to the one that's the data field, not the one that's the local parameter. And we only have to do that if we name them both the same thing. If we name them different things, we don't have to put that extra step in. So let's try writing a setter method for credits using the same variable name. So we need a data type of int, and then we want to name it the same thing so that we have to use the extra step. So we're going to say this dot credits. That means the one that's the data field. And then we're going to set that equal to the one that's the parameter. Credits. Cool. So at this point, we've written a class. We've included data fields and also some methods that are part of the class. Let's scroll through our notes, see if I did it the same way in the notes or if I did some different stuff. Looks good. So in the notes, I did the same name on the first name and the same name on the GPA, but then I used different names on last name and credits. And again, you can do either style. Usually people do all one style or all the other style. I just mixed and matched here just to show you that both are possibilities.